and to ring with all her might. The three waiting maids came running in at one door and the valet at another. "How is it that you cannot hear me when I ring for you?" said the Countess. "Tell Lizaveta Ivanovna that I am waiting for her." Lizaveta returned with her hat and cloak on. "At last you're here," said the Countess. "But why such an elaborate toilette? Whom do you intend to captivate? What sort of weather is it? It seems rather windy." "No, your Ladyship, it's very calm," replied the valet. "You never think of what you're talking about. Open the window. So it is, windy and bitterly cold. Unharness the horse. Lizaveta, we won't go out. There was no need for you to deck yourself like that." "What a life is mine!" thought Lizaveta Ivanovna. And in truth Lizaveta Ivanovna was a very unfortunate creature. "The bread of the stranger is bitter," said Dante, "and his staircase hard to climb." But who can know what the bitterness of dependence is so well as the poor companion of an old lady of quality? The Countess A had by no means a bad heart, but she was capricious, like a woman who had been spoilt by the world, as well as being avaricious and egotistical, like all old people who have seen their best days, and whose thoughts are with the past and not on the present. She participated in all the vanities of the great world, went to balls, where she sat in a corner, painted and dressed in old-fashioned style, like a deformed but indispensable ornament of the ballroom. All the guests on entering approached her and made a profound bow, as if in accordance with a set ceremony, but after that nobody took any further notice of her. She received the whole town at her house, and observed the strictest etiquette, although she could no longer recognize the faces of people. Her numerous domestics, growing fat and old in her antechamber and servants' hall, did just as they liked, and vied with each other in robbing the aged Countess in the most barefaced manner. Lizaveta Ivanovna was the martyr of the household. She made tea and was reproached with using too much sugar. She read novels aloud to the Countess, and the faults of the author were visited upon her head. She accompanied the Countess in her walks, and was answerable for the weather or the state of the pavement. A salary was attached to her post, but she very rarely received it. Although she was expected to dress like everyone else, that is to say, like very few indeed, in the society she played the most pitiable role. Everybody knew her, and nobody paid attention to her. At balls she danced only when a partner was wanted, and ladies would only take hold of her arm when it was necessary to lead her out of the room to attend to their dresses. She was very self-conscious, and felt her position keenly, and she looked about her with impatience for a deliverer to come to her rescue. But the young men, calculating in their giddiness, honoured her with but very little attention, although Lizaveta Ivanovna was 100 times prettier than the barefaced and cold-hearted marriageable girls around whom they hovered. Many a time did she quietly slink away from the glittering but wearisome drawing-room to go and cry in her own poor little room, in which stood a screen, a chest of drawers, a looking-glass, and a painted bedstead, and where a tallow candle burnt feebly in a copper candlestick. One morning, this was about 2 days after the evening party, described at the beginning of this story, and a week previous to the scene at which we have just assisted, Lizaveta Ivanovna was seated near the window at her embroidery frame, when, happening to look out into the street, she caught sight of a young engineer officer, standing motionless with his eyes fixed upon her window. She lowered her head and went on again with her work. About 5 minutes afterwards she looked out again. The young officer was still standing in the same place. Not being in the habit of coquetting with passing officers, she did not continue to gaze out into the street, but went on sewing for a couple of hours without raising her head. Dinner was announced. She rose up and began to put her embroidery away, but glancing casually out the window, she perceived the officer again. After dinner she went to the window with a certain feeling of uneasiness, but the officer was no longer there, and she thought no more about him. A couple of days afterwards, just as she was stepping into the carriage with the Countess, she saw him again. He was standing close behind the door, with his face half concealed by his fur collar, but his dark eyes sparkled beneath his cap. Lizaveta felt alarmed, though she knew not why, and she trembled as she seated herself in the carriage. On returning home she hastened to the window. The officer was standing in his accustomed place with his eyes fixed upon her. She drew back, a prey to curiosity, and agitated by a feeling which was quite new to her. From that time forward not a day passed without the young officer making his appearance under the window at the customary hour, and between him and her there was established a sort of mute acquaintance. Sitting in her place at work, she used to feel his approach, and raising her head, she would look at him longer and longer each day. The young man seemed to be very grateful to her. She saw with the sharp eye of youth how a sudden flush covered his pale cheeks each time their glances met. After about a week she commenced to smile at him. When Tomsky asked permission of his grandmother, the Countess, to present one of his friends to her, the young girl's heart beat violently. But hearing that Narumov was not an engineer, she regretted that by her thoughtless question she had betrayed her secret to the volatile Tomsky. Hermann was the son of a German who had become a naturalized Russian, and from whom he had inherited a small capital. Being firmly convinced of the necessity of preserving his independence, Hermann did not touch his private income, but lived on his pay without allowing himself the slightest luxury. Moreover, he was reserved and ambitious, and his companions rarely had an opportunity of making merry at the expense of his extreme parsimony. He had strong passions and an ardent imagination, but his firmness of disposition preserved him from the ordinary errors of young men. Thus, though a gamester at heart, he never touched a card, for he considered his position did not allow him, as he said, to risk the necessary in hope of winning the superfluous. Yet he would sit for nights together at the card table and follow with feverish anxiety the different turns of the game. The story of the three cards had produced a powerful impression upon his imagination, and all night long he could think of nothing else. If, he thought to himself the following evening, as he walked along the streets of St. Petersburg, if the old Countess would but reveal her secret to me, if she would only tell me the names of the three winning cards, why should I not try my fortune? I must get introduced to her and win her favour, become her lover. But all that will take time, and she is 87 years old. She might be dead in a week, in a couple of days even. But the story itself, can it really be true? No. Economy, temperance, and industry, those are my three winning cards. By means of them I shall be able to double my capital, increase it sevenfold, and procure myself ease and independence. Musing in this manner, he walked on until he found himself in one of the principal streets of St. Petersburg, in front of a house of antiquated architecture. The street was blocked with equipages. Carriages, one after the other, drew up in front of the brilliantly illuminated doorway. At one moment there stepped out onto the pavement the well-shaped little foot of some young beauty, at another the heavy boot of a cavalry officer, and then the silk stockings and shoes of a member of the diplomatic world. Furs and cloaks passed in rapid succession before the gigantic porter at the entrance. Hermann stopped. "Whose house is this?" he asked of the watchman at the corner. "The Countess A.'s," replied the watchman. Hermann started. The strange story of the three cards again presented itself to his imagination. He began walking up and down before the house, thinking of its owner and her strange secret. Returning late to his modest lodging, he could not go to sleep for a long time, and when at last he did doze off, he could dream of nothing but cards, green tables, piles of banknotes, and heaps of ducats. He played one card after another, winning uninterruptedly, and then he gathered up the gold and filled his pockets with the notes. When he woke up late the next morning, he sighed over the loss of his imaginary wealth, and then, sallying out into the town, he found himself once more in front of the Countess's residence. Some unknown power seemed to have attracted him thither. He stopped and looked up at the windows. At one of these he saw a head with luxuriant black hair, which was bent down, probably over some book or an embroidery frame. The head was raised. Hermann saw a fresh complexion and a pair of dark eyes. That moment decided his fate. 3. Lizaveta Ivanovna had scarcely taken off her hat and cloak when the Countess sent for her and again ordered her to get the carriage ready. The vehicle drew up before the door, and they prepared to take their seats. Just at that moment, when two footmen were assisting the old lady to enter the carriage, Lizaveta saw her engineer standing close beside the wheel. He grasped her hand. Alarm caused her to lose her presence of mind, and the young man disappeared, but not before he had left a letter between her fingers. She concealed it in her glove, and during the whole of the drive she neither saw nor heard anything. It was the custom of the Countess, when out for an airing in her carriage, to be constantly asking such questions as, "Who was that person that met us just now? What is the name of this bridge? What is written on that signboard?" On this occasion, however, Lizaveta returned such vague and absurd answers that the Countess became angry with her. "What is the matter with you, my dear?" she exclaimed. "Have you taken leave of your senses? Or what is it? Do you not hear me or understand what I say? Heaven be thanked, I am still in my right mind and speak plainly enough." Lizaveta Ivanovna did not hear her. On returning home, she ran to her room and drew the letter out of her glove. It was not sealed. Lizaveta read it. The letter contained a declaration of love. It was tender, respectful, and copied word for word from a German novel. But Lizaveta did not know anything of the German language, and she was quite delighted. For all that, the letter caused her to feel exceedingly uneasy. For the first time in her life she was entering into secret and confidential relations with a young man. His boldness alarmed her. She reproached herself for her imprudent behaviour, and knew not what to do. Should she cease to sit at the window, and by assuming an appearance of indifference towards him, put a check upon the young officer's desire for further acquaintance with her? Should she send his letter back to him, or should she answer him in a cold and decided manner? There was nobody to whom she could turn in her perplexity, for she had neither female friend nor adviser. At length she resolved to reply to him. She sat down at her little writing table, took pen and paper, and began to think. Several times she began her letter, and then tore it up. The way she had expressed herself seemed to be either too inviting or too cold and decisive. At last she succeeded in writing a few lines with which she felt satisfied. "I am convinced," she wrote, "that your intentions are honourable, and that you do not wish to offend me by any imprudent behaviour. But our acquaintance must not begin in such a manner. I return you your letter, and I hope that I shall never have any cause to complain of this undeserved slight." The next day, as soon as Hermann made his appearance,